look, the mic's on. I appreciate being here. I'm don't quite know what to say. I understand that immediately before lunch, there's nothing better than an hour of economics. So, so here I am to deliver on that threat. I need to start with a standard disclaimer that the views I'm about to express are mine alone, and not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta or the Federal Reserve System or any of my Federal Reserve colleagues. And if you think about that for a little while, it makes no sense, because otherwise, why would I be here? But we're going to go along with that idea, and we're going to say, look, whenever I use the pronoun we, I really mean I, okay? And we'll just maintain that myth as we go. What I want to do is kind of talk about, well, I'm going to do really two things. One is spend a little bit of time talking about the macroeconomic outlook. And of course, that's vital for everybody here, apart from just kind of your professional career goals. It's a good idea to kind of know what's going on in the macroeconomy, because if things turn out badly, we're kind of in trouble, and that's not a good thing. So we'll talk a little bit about the macroeconomy, and in particular where the risks are and how to think about this stuff as you kind of hear the nightly news and the kind of high-frequency data reports that come out. The trick is that if you're going to do economic forecasting, you actually never get it right. And so as a consequence, when you're wrong, the trick isn't that you know that you're wrong, because you're always wrong. The trick is that you have a way of thinking about what it means and where all this stuff gets related together. So what I'm going to do is spend a little bit of time talking about kind of the macroeconomy. It's a useful exercise, period, but it also kind of presents a foundation for a discussion of the labor market that I'm going to do. We've spent a lot of time at the Atlanta Fed thinking about labor market dynamics, and it actually turns out to generate some pretty cool pictures that usually I don't really like doing PowerPoints because they're evil. But look, here's a slide, and it's got squiggly lines and all that, and if you want that, there's a flyer I think in your swag bag, and certainly on the desk for our website. And there are all kinds of squiggly lines on our website, and that's pretty useful, actually. If you ever have to make presentations, all the stuff is there and free. So yeah, it's useful. Anyway. After talking about the real economy, and then I'll do a little bit about inflation, because that's something that people expect people from the central bank to talk about, then we'll talk about the labor markets. And they're all kind of connected. Remember, the whole trick, the reason the Federal Reserve is concerned about this is because Congress gave the Federal Reserve, Central Bank of the United States, a dual mandate. One is maximum sustainable employment, and two is price stability. And so, we talk about the macroeconomy generally, but what we're really trying to do, what our congressional mandate is to provide price stability and maximum sustainable employment. So it's important to kind of talk about what goes into that stuff. So here we go. And unfortunately, hearkening back to my first statement, this is going to sound an awful lot like a Principles of Economics lecture, because that's why they call it Principles of Economics. I'm sorry. We'll start with GDP. We had a really bad winter, and what that did was kill the first quarter of growth. If you think about what actually happens in making stuff, if you freeze out or close down for weather-related reasons, a segment of the economy, or a large segment of the economy, for just a couple of days out of a quarter, there are only 90 days in the quarter. So it's very difficult to make that up. And we think that the reason we got such a really crappy number, I like playing with this, by the way, this is pretty cool. We got a negative 1% growth in the first quarter of this year. We think it's largely because of weather-related issues. And so, you don't want to get too terribly excited when you hear kind of talking heads on TV saying, well, gee, this is really bad. We had a terrible first quarter, things are awful. We're going to get a rebound off that in the current quarter, and we're going to see something we think close to 4% in terms of growth. And then what you're going to hear is the opposite, that you're going to have people saying, well, look, this is a fabulous quarter, we're off to the races. Now the economy's completely back on track. And neither of those are true. It's going to be sometime late summer and probably sometime into the fall before we really get kind of a handle on how the underlying economy is performing, absent this weather-related distortion. I mean, it was a big deal, and yeah, so if we look at the picture and kind of look at all the different components, and we see the only thing that's actually positive in the last quarter was consumption. Now, personal consumption is really important because in the United States, 70% of the economy is personal consumption expenditure. And that's actually larger than any other kind of major industrial economy. That's fine. The reason we work is to consume. So if you have a relatively advanced, relatively wealthy economy, you'd kind of expect that their share of consumption would go up. And that's fine. The trick, though, is that if consumers get skittish, you've got a problem because it is such a heavily consumer-oriented economy. Well, here's what personal consumption looks like. Things are getting better. The real PCEs are the solid lines, and then some components are the squiggly lines. The one big squiggly line, the yellow thing, is durables. In terms of this audience, that's something, when we think about workforce development, something that we really kind of aim for, because durables production tends to be relatively high-wage jobs. The problem is that durables consumption is very volatile. And so we've got this kind of trade-off. You can aim for producing relatively volatile goods that produce decent wages when you're working, or you can go for something more like services that are much more stable in terms of the business cycle, and they're actually in services wages are all over the place. So it's a little difficult to make that call. So anyway, we think consumption is on pretty good shape. Consumers retrench their balance sheet. Things are looking better. Income is going up. Employment's going up. All in all, if we were to talk about the economy right now and think about kind of where we are in a long-term stable growth path sense, we'd be in pretty good shape. The problem isn't that we're not doing things that aren't sustainable right now in a very good sense. The problem is that we've got relatively high unemployment. And so what we want is something that is explicitly temporary to happen. We want a burst of activity that's going to generate a lot of jobs and bring us back to something closer to full employment. And then going back to something that is perfectly stable and kind of nice in the long run sense is great. But getting that temporary burst is difficult, and it just hasn't happened in this recovery. That isn't true for any other recovery in the post-war period. That when we look at the U.S., at the history of the United States, it's always been the case that as you have steep recessions, you have very steep recoveries. And if you have a relatively shallow recession, you have a relatively shallow recovery. That just didn't happen this time around. We had a particularly bad recession, and the recovery from it has been, middling. Okay, middling is a technical term, by the way. One of the reasons it's been middling is at the government level. When you hear Chair Bernanke or Chair Yellen talk about fiscal policy working at cross purposes to monetary policy, that's true. That if you look at this stuff, what you see is that state and local government and federal government have been major negatives in economic growth over the last couple of years. Now we think that's going away, that at the state and local government level, that's about 60% of government's actual contribution to the economy, that state and local governments pay all of you, and they buy the buses, and they buy the goods and services. At the federal level, spending's a lot bigger, but most of it's transfer payments that show up someplace else. So when state and local governments got in trouble because of declines in income tax and property tax revenue, you saw big retrenchments at the state and local level, and that really was a hindrance to economic recovery. In the last quarter, well, not the last quarter, the fourth quarter over here, that was the sequestration that we saw kind of at the federal level. The stuff actually hit and took a full percentage point off fourth quarter growth. So we think that's probably largely over. At the state and local level, while the income streams are not back to where they were in 2007, at the same time the negatives are over. So we're not expecting an awful lot in terms of real strength from state and local spending. I mean, the budgets are getting better. But the negatives, the unexpected cuts or salary freezes or whatever, I think are largely over. And so just by eliminating the negatives, you end up with a higher overall growth rate. And it's been the government sector that has been the primary negative sector for the last 2.5 years. So just by getting rid of that negative, we end up with a little bit more solid growth path. Well, the final thing we think about is trading with the rest of the world. And there the forecast looks better. If we think about kind of where we are in terms of trade, we trade with Latin America, we trade with developing Asia. We separate China out just because it probably should be in developing Asia, but if you put them together, they're really huge. Anyway, and the big thing is the euro area. That the euro area is, as a blob, the largest economy on the planet. And so the fact that they're not in recession anymore is by itself helpful. And so when we look around for trading opportunities, the rest of the world's looking fairly positive, and we're fairly optimistic on the trade side. Okay, so that's the real outlook, what's going on. We think things are looking a little bit better. Things are fairly solid. There's no immediate real threats out there, and some reasonable hope for a decent enough growth path over the next couple of years. Now let's talk about prices. We like to look at the PCE index. It's not all that different from the Consumer Price Index. Technically, it's preferable, but they don't do really very different things. But what you do see is that while the Fed has sort of said, look, price stability in a conceptual sense is probably consistent with about 2% inflation. We haven't had anything like that for a long time. That's a little troubling for some of us that have been trained as economists, that we have seen the central bank add an awful lot of liquidity to the economy, and yet prices remain a little on the soft side. That is disturbing, and it's something that we have talked about at length in Federal Open Market Committee minutes. When we look at where the softness is coming from, if we look at goods prices, they're kind of all over the place. In general, they're negative. It's because TVs are coming down in price. The productivity associated with technology improvements is systematically bringing prices of goods down in a serious way. But the real trick is on the service side, that service inflation has been fairly weak. It went down an awful lot in 2009, and then really hasn't recovered back to where it was pre-recession. A lot of that is medical care, which we suspect is a transitory thing. That there's an awful lot of reason to think that medical care pricing may have been disturbed in some sense by the reforms that have been accompanying the Affordable Care Act. Whether that would result in higher inflation or lower inflation isn't really obvious to me, at least. It seems to have resulted in lower, but it's a little hard to believe that that's going to last for a long period of time. So, consistent with our kind of statements associated with policy, we think we're going to see prices come up, inflation come up to something like 2% over forecast horizon of 2015. And this is kind of consistent with what inflation what inflation-protected securities are telling us. If we look at forward rates in financial futures markets, what we see is that they expect kind of lower inflation than we saw earlier in the recovery period, but nothing really to get worried about in terms of deflation, and things are kind of firming up over the last few months. Okay, now let me turn to labor markets, and this is the whole message that I want to try and convey here is that labor market discussions and labor market dynamics are really, really complicated. And I'll try and give some overview here, but I guess in the end, the idea is that you should come away from this talk a lot more confused than you were going in, because things are a lot less clear than you might think. So every Friday, every first Friday of the month, including this next Friday, we get the jobs report, the payroll report, and everybody looks at the unemployment numbers and everybody looks at payroll employment. And last month we had 288,000 jobs added. Well, that's pretty good. That's a wonderful thing. The problem is that isn't actually what happened in the labor market. What actually happens in the labor market in any one month, in any one typical month, is about 4 to 5 million people lose their jobs, and about 4 to 5 million people get jobs. And the difference between those two is that 288,000. So you have this enormous churn going on in the economy. You've got more or less 9 million people that are changing their employment status from one month to the next. And out of that comes this net number. You know, what to say about that? If you think about it in those terms, the numbers that you're looking at here are kind of wildly unreflective of the dynamics in the labor market. There's an awful lot going on here. It just happens that over time, we are systematically adding jobs, which is a good thing. But it is kind of amazing that you know, we've boiled it down to this simple number. If we go on to the unemployment rate, that's the yellow line or greenish line here, what you see is it went way up in the recession, and it's been coming down fairly steadily since then. Part of that is because of a decline in labor force participation, that the share of the population that is engaged in the labor force is coming down. There are a lot of reasons for that. One of the not so trivial reasons actually is retirement. It happens that the baby boomers aging out of the labor force more or less coincided with the start of the recession. And so you have this kind of confounding effect that even if there were no recession, it would still be the case that labor force participation is coming down just because you have all these people that have aged out and are going into into retirement. It's also the case, as all of you are well aware, when the unemployment number comes out, there are actually 6 coming out. And of course, everyone pays attention to that on a regular basis. We'll get to that in a second. But what I want to do is kind of offer a decomposition of labor market performance that we've come up with at the Atlanta Fed. You can go to our website and get this on a real basis. But because there is all this churning and all this kind of just noise associated with labor market dynamics, we thought it was a really good idea to try and break out different measures and try and understand what's going on in the labor force in real time. And so what we've done is we've kind of taken the labor force and said, well, gee, you know, what do we really want to know about labor force metrics? Well, obviously the first thing to know is leading indicators. That, you know, we want to know, you know, what things are telling us that things are getting either better or worse in a leading sense. Another thing we want to worry about is worker utilization. That, you know, this is kind of the part-time for economic reasons or the inappropriately employed people, the people who could be utilized better in the labor market but aren't. And that's kind of an efficiency measure. Then there's confidence, both on the worker and on the employer side. And finally, employer behavior itself. There are a lot of different measures of what employers are up to that provide some indication of strength in the labor market. So we kind of thought about these 4 different things to think about. And what we did was come up with 13 measures of these, and I'll walk through all of them. This is tedious, but it's worth it. Okay, let's start with leading indicators, because this is all stuff that we hear about. In terms of leading indicators, one of the big leading indicators is temporary employment. That it is the case that temp employment tends to lead overall hiring. It is also the case that there are changes in the labor force and labor market dynamics that lead us to think that some temp employment is a lot more long-term than it has been in the past. But it's still the case that kind of a temp to perm job path is a fairly common path, and to the extent that firms are taking on temp workers, it's an indication that overall hiring intentions are picking up and things are getting better. Second thing is the difficult to fill jobs. That the National Federation of Independent Businesses asks their members, are you having trouble finding workers? And this is actually kind of important, because the issue now, and one that all of you in this room are and in some level concerned with, is workforce development. That it may be that there are a lot of jobs out there waiting to be filled, but that nobody has the skill set to fill them. And if that's the case, well, you can do things at a macro level that will continue to create additional demand for workers, but if you don't have the workers that are appropriately skilled to fill the jobs, you got a problem. So the difficult to fill slot is a measure of kind of how tight labor markets are in terms of skill mismatches. Initial claims are also a good leading indicator. That's the number of people that are getting laid off. That comes out every Thursday. And that number actually has been coming down recently, and that's a fairly good indication that firms are decreasing their layoffs. Now let me turn to utilization, because that's where actually all the questions really come up when we get into arguments about the labor market. And the biggest one is working part-time for economic reasons. These are people that would like to take full-time jobs, but the full-time job isn't available, so they're working part-time. There are part-time people who want to work part-time. Those people aren't counted in this. But part-time for economic reasons is one of the big issues now that you hear in discussions of the labor force. And it's a pretty good measure of utilization, that you want to work full-time, but you just can't find a job that'll give you the hours. Next measure is job finding rate, that if the rate at which people find jobs that are looking for them is going up, that's a suggestion that labor market utilization is getting better. The next is marginally attached workers, and this is kind of tough. That in order to be counted as unemployed, you have to actually be looking for work. If you're not looking for work, you don't get counted as unemployed. But you may get counted as marginally attached. Those are people that would be available to take a job, but haven't looked in the last year. The way to think about that is kind of the typical discouraged worker, that we've sat around and have looked for work in the past and didn't find it, and you look outside your door and conditions look exactly the same as they did yesterday. So there's not a real point in going out and knocking on employers' doors to see if you can get a job. But if a job came along, you would take it. So they're not officially in the kind of standard measure of unemployment, but they are available and they are out there to be employed if conditions improve. Both them and the working part-time for economic reasons are sort of where the big discussion about kind of labor market condition measurement have been focused over the last few months. Unemployed is just the standard unemployment rate. We're all kind of familiar with that. On the confidence side, quits. That if you are voluntarily leaving a job, we view that as a sign of confidence. That the reason you're leaving is because you think that things are good enough to get out of a job you don't want to be in anymore. And you may not be able to do that if you don't think that you can find an alternative. And so in terms of an actual expression, a measurable expression of confidence on the part of the workers, their willingness to leave an existing job is a pretty good sign. Conference Board has a job availability index where they ask employers or measure employers that are actually posting jobs available. That's a pretty good sign of confidence. And it's parallel to the National Federation of Business Hiring Plans, that if you ask businesses, are you going to hire in the next few months, and they say, yeah, we think we're going to, well, that's because they're confident that things are getting better. And then we can actually look at what employers do. And this comes to something that Chair Yellen has referred to, and I think we're all going to have to start paying attention to this. Instead of looking at the employment numbers that come out first Friday of every month, we're going to have to start looking at a thing called the JOLTS data, which is an acronym, obviously, for job openings, layoffs, turnovers, and separations. That is the measure that actually computes and reports the churn in the labor market, the number of openings, the number of separations, what's really going on in a deep sense. It's not as clean as one number, the unemployment rate. 6.3 is easy to understand. A very messy picture of lots of turnover in the job market and lots of hiring in the job market is messier, but it's also probably a better depiction of actual conditions. Well, out of the JOLTS, they tell you how many people actually got hired. They tell you the number of vacancies. And then on the payroll side, that's the number that comes out, again, first Friday of every month, the net number of new jobs created. Okay, so those are the 13 indicators that we look at for the labor market. Now, we're going to standardize this stuff, okay? The black ring on the outside is where we were at the peak in 2007. The little line inside is where we were at the very trough of the recovery, okay? And then you've got these marks on the way out. So each little bar here is a 25% recovery, 50% recovery, 75% recovery, on and on. And so, yeah, there we go. So yeah, Q4 2007 is the peak, and Q4 2009 is the trough. And here's a picture of what has actually happened to the economy over the last 3 years. And I think this is really cool because it really demonstrates the difficulty of providing a simple assessment of where the labor market is. If you look at leading indicators, temporary services are great. That temp employment is far beyond where it was at the beginning of the recession. Difficult to fill positions suggest that employers are actually having more trouble finding appropriate workers right now than they did in 2007. Okay, so in that sense, the jobs are out there ready to be filled. And initial claims, that is the number of people being laid off by workers, by firms, is better than it was during the peak. So if we look at kind of forward-looking indicators of the labor market, things look really good. In a macro sense, you could look around and say, well, gee, we got a lot of openings, we got a lot of difficult to fill positions, and things are looking a lot better. And yeah, so just to be clear here, this outer ring is the contemporaneous number, and each inner one is the year before, year-over-year stuff. And you can do this going back. Okay. So leading indicators are saying, yeah, the labor market's really getting better, and it looks like it's going to get better in the future. But then we look at utilization, and there things are really pretty crappy, okay? And again, that's another technical term. If you look at, well, in particularly, the marginally attached workers, people who, this is the discouraged worker number, only recently has it gotten better than it was during the depths of the recession. That actually, after the depths of the recession, marginally attached workers got worse for a couple of years, actually, following the recession. And so the trick there is that when people complain about unutilized workers because there's this vast number of people that are not officially counted as unemployed, but really are available for work, that's a legitimate complaint. And it's only been getting a little bit better than the depths of the recession only in the last couple of months. Job finding rates getting a little bit better, but another big problem is working part-time for economic reasons. That the share of workers that would like to work full-time but can't find full-time employment really hasn't improved all that much over time. That it's better than it was by about a third, but when you look at the numbers, you say, no, we've got a long way to go before we're recovered, and that again is a fairly important measure of utilization. And just as an aside, what's kind of funny is if you look at the unemployment rate, that's the one we typically talk about. It is kind of reflective if you were going to take a number to summarize what's going on in the chart. And the unemployment rate, I think it's largely accidental, but it certainly is pretty reflective of an average of all the other indicators. On the confidence side, one of the kind of cool things I see is a real acceleration in quits. We're not back to where we were in the peak, but it's very clear that employee confidence is getting better. The hiring plans, certainly NFIB hiring plans have come up pretty considerably over the last year after being stalled for a couple of years. And then on the employer behavior thing, payroll numbers are about back to where they were at the peak in 2007. Vacancies continue to be a little bit low, and hiring is not as rapid as we would like. But overall, you get this picture that is not at all clear. And that's kind of the point here, that we look at kind of leading indicators in terms of sort of macroeconomic policy, and things look pretty good. And then you get into the trenches and ask, well, how effectively deployed are the workers? And the answer is not so much. And confidence and employer behaviors are somewhere in between. But that actually gives a reasonably, I think, useful assessment of labor market conditions, and it kind of shows the difficulty of providing a simple answer to the question of, well, are things getting better? The answer is, yeah. There. Okay. As I was saying earlier, when the unemployment rate's released, there are actually 6 numbers produced. The one we typically talk of is called U3, which is the standard measure of unemployment. It means that you were, not employed and were out looking for work over the last 4 weeks. But there are other measures, and the one we kind of like looking at is called U6, which is a much broader measure of unemployment. That includes the marginally attached and the part-time for economic reasons. So this is a broad measure of not just workers who are available coming out of a state of unemployment, but also workers who are available either coming out of the non-labor force or coming out of part-time into full-time employment. So the U6 measure is a much broader measure of kind of the weakness or the slack in the labor force. Now, I mean, there is an arbitrariness associated with however you measure this, and that's inevitable. But it used to be the case, if you look at the picture here, that all the numbers tracked pretty much together. So you had this gap between U3, U4, U5, and U6. But when you looked at movements in any one measure, it kind of corresponded to movements in the other. That while they're not measuring exactly the same thing, they were sending the same signals. That broke down in the recession. And what we've seen is that particularly the part-time for economic reasons ballooned in the recession. And it has not come back down. It is coming down. The gap between U3 and U6 is coming down actually faster than U3 is coming down. But it's still the case that we are not anywhere near where we were pre-recession, that our part-time for economic reason segment of the workforce is much larger than it's historically been and remains problematic. In terms of the marginally employed, there's an enormous churn there too, that as the Department of Labor goes out and surveys all these people, they ask an astounding array of questions to these survey participants. And what we're really concerned with is the dynamics associated with the individuals in the survey. And so here we're asking, well, gee, if you were marginally attached, what happened? Did you move into the ranks of the labor force? That is, you were in U6 the previous month, and now the question is, how often do you come out of that marginally attached status and actually go into the labor force, either looking for a job or finding a job? And the answer is 40% of the people from one month to the next change their status. So if you have been discouraged and haven't looked for a job in a long time, the probability of your changing that status is actually quite high in any one month. And then the question is, well, why are they changing their status? The blue line is the number of people that have gone from not looking for work to looking for work but not finding it. That number is elevated. So moving from being discouraged but having to go out and try and find a job and moving into the formerly unemployed segment, that's gone up. There's also a segment that wasn't really looking for work but found a job anyway. That segment has actually been fairly stable throughout the recovery, but it's lower than it was during the peak, during the normal expansion of the aughts. We also look at part-time for economic reason workers and ask, well, what are they doing in terms of their standing? It used to be, prior to the recession, the blue line here, that not overwhelmingly, but about half of the part-time for economic reason workers in any one month were moving to full-time status. So they were leaving the PTER designation and getting full-time jobs. And then you have about 30% of the people who are part-time for economic reasons last month and are staying in that category this month. That number jumped, and in fact those two series, as you can see, have kind of reversed. That the share of part-time for economic reason workers that used to be finding full-time work is now kind of switched places with those that are staying in part-time. And the share of part-time workers that are actually moving to full-time work is down around the share that was stuck in part-time prior to the recession. So there's been a huge change here in kind of the behavior in labor markets with regard to part-time versus full-time work. And then these other two lines add, just for the sake of completeness, so that the picture adds up to 100%, that you can move out of the labor force. There are different things you can do. You can also move. You can come into part-time for economic reasons from unemployment. So all this stuff has to add up. There we go. If we look at where the jobs are in the people that are taking part-time jobs because they don't have any other choice, it's the usual suspects. Leisure and hospitality. That share is rising pretty notably. Wholesale and retail trade, the stores are pushing more people into part-time on kind of an involuntary basis. Education's coming up, but not all that bad. I think a lot of that is health services. Construction is falling in terms of part-time for economic reasons, but a lot of that is because construction per se fell off. so that there's not as much building as there was prior to the recession. And so the people that have stuck around in that business tend to be more fully employed than they were in the past. And as a share within industry, it's kind of the same story, that leisure and hospitality have kind of the highest share of part-time for economic reason workers. And then kind of at the bottom, of course, are the more skilled education and healthcare. The final question, and then I'll shut up. Final question we got to deal with is, so what? In terms of all this crap about part-time unemployment and marginally attached workers, does that matter in some sense? And this work is very, very preliminary, but somewhat instructive. And what we've done here is we've said, well, look, whether you are a discouraged worker, that is, not actually looking for work, or whether you are just long-term unemployed. So if you've looked for work and are counted officially in the unemployment rate, but you haven't found a job for the last year, so you're long-term unemployed, but you are still unemployed, do labor markets actually distinguish between those two? That is, when we look at the difference between U3 and U6 for the purposes of thinking about labor market dynamics, does it really matter whether or not you've been out looking for a job? Or is it the case that it's sort of a skill issue, that where you really see a difference in labor market performance is in the part-time for economic reason people, that is, people that are currently working but want to move to full-time employment, but clearly are employable because they currently have a job, it's just not full-time. And then the short-term unemployment, that is, people that have been unemployed for less than 26 weeks. Those are people that have just been laid off or just been terminated from their job. And again, it's clear kind of to employers, or we think this is a reasonable distinction, that they have skills that can take you into a new job. So here's the story. You're an employer and you're looking for work, and you're concerned about whether or not the person on the other side of the table can actually do the job. Well, if they were laid off recently, and so they're short-term unemployed, you might say, well, yeah, they can do the job because they were just doing it over there, but they got canned because the company closed. Or if they're part-time for economic reasons, they are currently doing the job right now, they just want more hours and are coming to you for work. And so is that the distinction that we should be looking at rather than unemployment versus marginally attached? And basically we plot these against wage growth, and the fit looks actually okay. Again, this is very preliminary stuff, and it's going to be decades before we actually have any solid academic evidence to support the plan or support the hypothesis. But kind of as a working hypothesis, what we really want to do is, in thinking about outreach to kind of adult education types and where we need to focus job training efforts, it's really not a distinction between unemployed versus out of the labor force. It really is that the part-time and the recently unemployed are in pretty good shape. And that is what the labor market's responding to. I don't want to say they're in pretty good shape, that's not true. But they are the factors that are moving wage pressure in the economy. And it's not so much the long-term unemployed and the people that are marginally attached. Those are the people that really need to be addressed when we think about retraining and bringing them into a labor force where they can actually participate and contribute. So with all that, it's time to stop. So I will. If you have questions, are we going to do questions? I don't really care. I actually am going to hang out for a little while, so if you want to ask questions there, but yeah, we'll let her moderate questions. Anybody? I realize I've been super clear and no one would ever have any questions. Yeah, I did.
Hello? Couple of questions.
I actually can't see all of you out there. So I assume all of you stayed awake, but
That's good.
that's probably a bad assumption.
Can you see me? Can you see me?
No.
Oh, good, okay. It's Sandy.
Yeah.
Okay. A couple of things occur to me. Because this is a group of educators, if people are working part-time, one, they have the time to go to school, and two, they could be training in something, they could be wanting to be training in something other than what they're currently working in. And that might be, it might suggest different sort of educational forms, if you will, schedule-wise, potentially. But also just sort of looking at the substance of what you're training them in might be different than what they're currently working. That's one sort of observation. Yeah?
Okay. Let me comment on that.
Yeah.
That isn't nearly as true as it used to be.
Okay.
And boy, we are seeing this as a huge problem. That as we look at people that are part-time for economic reasons, particularly in leisure and hospitality and in wholesale and retail trade, it's part-time for economic reasons, but it's on-demand employment. That what's happening is that your schedule is being optimized by some algorithm that says you need to work from 2:30 to 6:30 at the store this afternoon and from 12:45 to 9 o'clock or whatever tomorrow. And that varies, and you are an on-call temporary employment. And particularly for restaurants and leisure and hospitality, this has become a big thing, that just as you do kind of just-in-time inventory to minimize the amount of inventory you've got on hand, you're doing just-in-time employment, where you have part-time employees that have to come in at irregular and, from the employee's point of view, fairly unpredictable times, which just kills the ability to schedule classes.
But maybe you need a new format of just-in-time learning.
Yeah, right. That is the response, that you have to do something other than have an organized, pre-scheduled class. That works great for a lot of things, but not everything. And that's a real challenge. I mean, if you think about learning HTML, well, you can probably do that on demand, and that's a useful thing. If you're trying to learn to weld, you really need to show up where there's, the welding equipment and somebody teaching you, and that needs to be kind of scheduled ahead of time. And I mean, it varies from occupation to occupation.
But employers are having just-in-time scheduling of people working at the work site, and maybe there's a way to have just-in-time use of facilities so that the welding class can also sort of accommodate that kind of idea. Yeah. Okay. Here was my other thing. The spider chart I thought was really fascinating, and a couple of things. One is the leading indicators are suggesting what's leading, so what's coming up. So, A, do you think it's possible that the results just haven't shown yet?
Well, sure, that's a possibility.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of by definition,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Okay, but the other thing is, these new employment relationship structures that are happening, I'm just wondering where these come in, which is like, I'm an independent contractor, but I want a part-time regular JOB with somebody because I want to start my side business, and so I might be, so that sort of whole notion of being an independent contractor versus being an employee, where that fits in this whole business.
Yeah, formally, that is a very serious problem with the temp help measurement. If you look at the real expansion in temp help, that isn't where this is happening. We're pretty aware of this and not quite sure how to deal with it. The idea of, for example, programmers that are basically contract workers, they are explicitly temporary workers, but that's just kind of the way the lifestyle is. that segment of the labor market really hasn't changed very much during the recovery. It's much bigger than it was 20 years ago. But in terms of kind of where the temp help, the surge in the temp help employment is, it's in the traditional kind of temp to work field. It's not necessarily that they're moving as rapidly as they have been in the past, but it is, we're still pretty confident that this signal is real. It may not be as strong as it seems, but it is real nonetheless. So yeah, we're okay there for a little while. Actually, if you read our, we have a blog that comments on this stuff regularly called Macro Blog. Everybody should read it. I think that is a topic that will be addressed in this in a couple of months when the preliminary work gets done, to really kind of sort through that stuff.
Thank you. Just want to remind you again that both on the tables and in your bags are where you might be able to get some of this economic information. So we've heard about partnering with Chamber of Commerce types, the workforce innovation boards, etc. And the stuff on the tables is swag, and you're welcome to pick up anything that has a gold logo on it from anywhere except someone else's possession. I'm standing between you and lunch.
Let me add one more thing before all of you go. You know, as I started out talking about, consumption is actually, you know, kind of the main driver of the economy, and all of you are more or less gainfully employed. So go buy stuff, okay? Doesn't matter what, just yeah.
And
do
on
it.
your way to the dining room, don't forget to sign in for day 2 in case you didn't. Thank you, Tom.